before we uncover the storylines that never made it into the games, hit like and subscribe. This is the full breakdown of every scrapped and cut Resident Evil plot. The characters who were erased, the endings that were abandoned, and the ideas that were too dark, too strange, or too dangerous to ever see the light of day. The official history of the Resident Evil franchise is a curated narrative of success and evolution, but beneath the surface lies a vast graveyard of abandoned ideas and silenced timelines. A scrapped storyline within the Capcom hierarchy is defined as any narrative arc character or pivotal event that reached the design or script phase, but was ultimately removed to maintain brand consistency or technical feasibility. The corporation utilizes a process known as silent retcons, where an event or a character is simply never mentioned again, effectively pruning the timeline without the need for an official public explanation. This surgical removal of content often erases the darker, more experimental roots of the series, in favor of a cohesive and action-oriented modern canon that appeals to a broader global audience. To understand the true nature of Resident Evil, one must look at what was left on the cutting room floor, because the most terrifying ideas are often the ones the developers were too afraid to release. The clinical reality of this erasure is driven by the tension between artistic vision and commercial viability. In the early years, the developers were constantly pushing the boundaries of what a video game could represent in terms of psychological horror and biological terror. However, as the franchise grew into a multi-billion-dollar asset, the room for experimentation narrowed. Storylines that explored the darker depths of human depravity or that challenged the player's sense of moral certainty were often deemed too risky for a mainstream product. This led to a systematic smoothing of the narrative, where the rough edges of the original biological nightmare were polished into a more palatable science fiction action experience. The silent retcon serves as the primary tool for this smoothing, allowing Capcom to move forward without the weight of past inconsistencies or overly disturbing themes that no longer align with the current brand identity. Furthermore, the erasure of history is often a response to the technical limitations of the time. Many storylines were cut because the hardware of the original PlayStation or the GameCube could not support the complex psychological effects or the scale of the horror the developers envisioned. When these technical hurdles were met, the narrative was often simplified to fit the constraints of the engine. However, even as technology improved, the habit of cutting the most extreme ideas remained. Capcom learned that the public responded better to the B-movie aesthetic of heroic survivors and clear villains rather than the oppressive and hopeless tone of the early drafts. This shift created a divide between the ghost lore, known to internal developers, and the official canon consumed by the public. The erased history remains a haunting reminder of a franchise that almost became a niche psychological study rather than an action blockbuster. The sorrow of this lost history is the realization that we are only seeing a fraction of the original nightmare. For every character, like Leon or Jill, there are dozens of erased survivors who were meant to have profound impacts on the story. For every viral outbreak we witnessed, there were more extreme biological scenarios that were deemed too ethically crossed for public consumption. This archive serves as a forensic audit of those lost moments. We are looking back at the versions of Raccoon City that never happened and the monsters that were never allowed to exist. By exhuming these scrapped storylines, we gain a deeper understanding of the internal panic and the corporate decisions that shaped the world of Resident Evil. The erased history is not just a collection of discarded files, but a roadmap of the fear that Capcom themselves felt, when they realized how dark their creation could truly become. Before the legendary release of the first Resident Evil in 1996, the early builds of the project featured a tone and a level of visceral horror that was far more extreme than the final product. The original concept was intended as a spiritual successor to the Famicom title Sweet Home, and it featured heavy supernatural undertones and the permanent death of key characters. This version of the Arklay Mansion was a place of oppressive dread, where the boundary between biological science and the paranormal was intentionally blurred. Capcom eventually backed away from this extreme tone, fearing that the sheer intensity of the horror would limit the game's commercial appeal and alienate the casual consumer. This pivot toward a B-movie, science fiction aesthetic was a strategic decision to ensure the franchise had a future in a market that was not yet ready for the pure psychological devastation of the original draft. The original horror tone was focused on a sense of absolute vulnerability and psychological breaking points. In the early designs, the characters were not elite soldiers, but individuals who were entirely overwhelmed by the forces they encountered. The mansion itself was meant to be a sentient entity of sorts, a place where the walls would shift and the shadows would move independently of the light. This was a direct legacy of Sweet Home, where the environment was as much of a threat as the creatures within it. Capcom felt that this approach was too abstract and potentially too confusing for the Western audience. They decided to ground the horror in the more understandable concepts of viral mutation and corporate conspiracy. This move saved the franchise from becoming a niche occult title, but it also meant that the most haunting elements of the mansion's original design were lost forever. Furthermore, the early builds featured a much more graphic depiction of death and mutilation. The biological organic weapons were not just monsters. They were recognizably human beings in various stages of a horrific and painful transformation. The developers wanted the player to feel the weight of every kill, to recognize that the creatures they were fighting were once innocent people who had been subjected to unimaginable torture. Capcom eventually simplified these designs to make them feel more like traditional monsters, reducing the psychological toll on the player. This reduction of the visceral impact was a necessary step to secure a wider release without facing extreme censorship or a restrictive age rating in international markets. The fear that almost replaced action was a pure and unfiltered version of biological terror that would not be seen again in the series for decades. Capcom realized that they had a product that was too effective at scaring its audience. They understood that if the game was too dark, it would become a chore to play rather than an entertainment experience. By injecting the B-movie humor and the heroic archetypes of the STARS members, they created a buffer between the player and the horror. This buffer allowed Resident Evil to become a global phenomenon, but it also buried the original vision of a hopeless occult nightmare. The version that was too dark to release remains a legend among the original development team, a reminder of a time when the franchise was standing on the edge of a much deeper and more terrifying abyss. The most famous scrap project in the history of the medium is Resident Evil 1.5, a version of the second game that reached 80% completion before it was entirely discarded. This lost Canon timeline featured a protagonist named Elsa Walker, a motorcycle racer and university student in place of the Claire Redfield we know today. The Raccoon city depicted in this build was fundamentally different from the Gothic museum-like aesthetic of the final release. The police station in 1.5 was a modern clinical office building with bright fluorescent lights and a functional contemporary layout. This version of the game was scrapped in 1997 because the producers felt the experience was too boring and lacked the cinematic flair required to follow the success of the first title. The clinical nature of 1.5 was an attempt to ground the biological outbreak in a realistic urban environment. The developers wanted the player to feel as though they were in a real police precinct that had been overrun by a sudden and violent event. However, the result was an environment that felt cold and sterile compared to the haunting atmosphere of the original mansion. The decision to restart development was a pivotal moment in Capcom's history, as it demonstrated their willingness to throw away millions of dollars to ensure the brand maintained a specific atmospheric standard. Elsa Walker's erased existence is a testament to this corporate perfectionism. She was a fully realized character with her own motivations and dialogue, but she was deleted in an instant because she didn't fit the emerging Redfield legacy. Furthermore, the Raccoon city of 1.5 featured different enemy placements and a more aggressive viral progression. The zombies in this version were more varied, and the damage they took was depicted with a greater level of anatomical detail. There were also entirely different subplots involving the survivors within the station. The game was much closer to completion than any other scrapped Resident Evil project, which is why it has become the ultimate holy grail for fans and digital archaeologists. The lost timeline of 1.5 represents a fork in the road where the series almost became a more realistic tactical horror experience. By rejecting this path, Capcom moved toward the gothic operatic style that would define the series for the next decade, cementing the idea that Resident Evil is about more than just survival. It is about the grand tragedy of the environment itself. The clinical sorrow of 1.5 is the total erasure of a functional world. When the project was scrapped, every line of code, every character model, and every environmental asset was relegated to the archives. Elsa Walker became a ghost lore figure, her only remaining presence being a bonus costume in the modern remakes. This was the moment Capcom realized that brand consistency was more important than progress. They understood that the audience wanted the gothic and the strange, rather than the clinical and the real. The lost Canon timeline of 1997 remains a fascinating look at what happens when a corporation decides that a nearly finished product is not good enough. It is the most significant silent retcon in the history of the franchise, a total deletion of a world that was 80% ready to be born. In the lost timeline of Resident Evil 1.5, the narrative outcomes for several key characters were fundamentally different and far more bleak than the final version released in 1998. Specifically, characters like Marvin Branner and Robert Kendo were intended to be permanent supporting characters who could actually survive the game, depending on the player's actions. In this version, Marvin was not just a tragic casualty who gave Leon his orders. He was a vital part of the tactical defense of the station. Robert Kendo was not a shopkeeper who was eaten in the first 5 minutes, but a rugged survivor who helped the protagonists navigate the city. These characters were reduced to cameos in the final version to create a greater sense of isolation and hopelessness for the main protagonists. The storylines cut from 1.5 were often deemed too bleak for the final product because they depicted the total collapse of the human spirit. There were sequences involving officers committing suicide within the precinct and graphic depictions of the T-virus's effects on the human psyche. The developers originally wanted to show that the virus didn't just turn people into monsters. It caused a slow and agonizing descent into madness and physical decay. This was simplified for the final Resident Evil 2 release to keep the pacing fast and the focus on action. By removing these slower, more psychological moments, Capcom made the game more accessible, but they lost the depth of the tragedy they had originally envisioned for the people of Raccoon City. Furthermore, the relationship between the protagonists was entirely different. Because Elsa Walker had no connection to Chris Redfield, her motivations were purely about survival and helping the people around her. This lacked the narrative hook of the search for a missing sibling, which Capcom felt was necessary to tie the sequel to the original game. The erasure of Elsa meant the erasure of her specific interactions with the survivors of the precinct. Many of the dialogue files recovered from the 1.5 leak show a much more cynical and desperate version of Leon Kennedy. He was not the idealistic rookie we know today, but a man who was quickly becoming hardened by the realization that his fellow officers had failed in their duty. This version of Leon was erased to make room for a more traditional hero arc. The clinical sorrow of these erased events is the realization that Raccoon City was originally meant to be a much more populated and complex tragedy. By simplifying the story, Capcom focused the player's attention on a few key individuals, but they erased the stories of dozens of others who were meant to matter. The survival of characters like Marvin or Kendo would have changed the entire trajectory of the series, making it feel less like a lonely horror game and more like a tactical struggle for a dying city. The version of the outbreak that was deemed too bleak remains a ghost lore archive, a reminder that the developers were once willing to explore the darkest corners of the human experience before the corporate mandate for a cohesive and heroic brand took over. The archives of the early Resident Evil development periods are filled with monster concepts and body horror ideas that were deemed too disturbing for public consumption in the 1990s. One of the most haunting scrap designs involved human-insect hybrids that retained recognizable human faces. These creatures were intended to scream for help in distorted voices while attacking the player, creating a state of extreme psychological distress. The idea was to force the player to confront the humanity of the monsters they were killing. Capcom executives eventually vetoed these designs, believing that the level of body horror was unacceptable and would likely lead to severe censorship or a total ban in international markets like Germany and Japan. Another scrapped concept was the man-spiders, which were human beings who had been mutated into arachnid shapes, but who retained their human intelligence and memories. These creatures would plead for their lives, or attempt to communicate with the player through the static of their biological corruption. This was a direct attempt to explore the ethical horror of Umbrella's research, showing that the victims were still inside the monsters. Capcom felt that this was too dark and would interfere with the player's ability to enjoy the combat. They wanted the enemies to be clearly defined as monsters rather than tragic victims. This decision to prioritize combat comfort over psychological depth is a recurring theme in the history of the series. Furthermore, there were designs for biological organic weapons that utilized fetal tissue or infantile features to evoke a deeper sense of revulsion. These were cut almost immediately as they crossed a moral line that Capcom felt would permanently damage the brand. The developers were interested in the absolute violation of the human form, but the corporation was focused on maintaining a level of horror that was marketable. The monsters we eventually saw, the tyrants, the hunters, and the lickers, were terrifying, but they were safely categorized as science fiction creatures. The scrap designs were much more grounded in the reality of human suffering making them far more difficult to process emotionally. The clinical reality of these cut designs is the study of where a corporation draws the line in the sand. Capcom understood that there is a difference between a monster that is scary and a monster that is genuinely upsetting. By removing the screaming faces and the pleas for help, they allowed the player to maintain a level of emotional distance. This distance is what allowed Resident Evil to become a fun action experience rather than a traumatic psychological ordeal. However, the lost designs remain a testament to the raw and unfiltered creativity of the original team. They were willing to go further into the darkness than the corporation was willing to follow. These monsters exist only in the dark corners of the internal archives, a haunting reminder of the pure biological horror that the franchise almost embraced. The disaster in Raccoon City was originally planned to be a far more complex and long-term event than the 3-day collapse we saw in the final games. The Raccoon City timeline that was almost canon featured an alternate outbreak progression where the city was slowly choked to death over the course of several weeks. In this version, the police and the National Guard attempted a series of large-scale containment operations that eventually failed. The streets were meant to be filled with the remnants of barricades and military checkpoints, showing a desperate but organized struggle against the virus. Capcom simplified this for the final release, focusing on a sudden and total collapse to create a more immediate sense of danger for the protagonists. The early drafts of the timeline included a detailed progression of the infection through the city's water supply and its public institutions. There were subplots involving the corruption of the city council and the systematic silencing of local journalists who were trying to expose Umbrella's involvement before the situation became terminal. This would have turned Raccoon City into a much larger political and social tragedy. Capcom felt that this level of detail was unnecessary for an action horror game, and that it slowed down the pacing of the narrative. They chose to skip the slow burn of the infection and jump straight to the chaos of the final hours, effectively erasing weeks of planned story content and hundreds of potential character interactions. Furthermore, the alternate timeline featured a much more significant role for the UBCS and other Umbrella tactical units. They were not just cleaners who arrived at the end, but were active participants in the city's life during the outbreak. There were planned missions where the player would encounter these units in the middle of their own desperate battles against the Horde. This would have added a layer of tactical complexity and a sense of a larger world moving outside the player's direct experience. By simplifying the timeline, Capcom made the player the center of the universe, but they lost the scale of the urban catastrophe. Raccoon City became a background for a few heroes, rather than a living and dying character in its own right. The clinical sorrow of the simplified timeline is the loss of the city's identity. In the scrapped drafts, Raccoon City was a place with a history and a future that were being systematically dismantled. In the final games, it is a series of levels to be navigated. The weeks of struggle and the failed attempts at order remain as ghost lore fragments found in a few scattered files. Capcom decided that the public wanted an explosion and a narrow escape rather than a detailed study of an urban death. This decision shaped the entire future of the franchise, ensuring that Resident Evil would always prioritize the immediate spectacle over the long-term narrative consequences. The Raccoon City that was almost canon is a much larger and more tragic place than the one we were allowed to visit. During the development of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, there were dozens of planned storylines for secondary characters and civilians who were meant to have significant arcs during the Raccoon City outbreak. These cancelled survivor stories were intended to provide a ground-level view of the disaster, showing the tragedy through the eyes of ordinary people like teachers, doctors, and office workers. One such story involved a group of children trapped in a school who had to be rescued by the protagonists. This was cut because Capcom felt that involving children in the graphic violence of the game was a bridge too far and would lead to massive controversy. This erasure of the most vulnerable victims made the city feel less like a real place and more like a tactical arena. Another cancelled arc involved a rogue Umbrella scientist who was hiding in the city with evidence of the company's crimes. This character was meant to provide a series of side quests that would have revealed more about the internal politics of the corporation. Capcom removed this character to keep the focus on the immediate survival of Leon and Claire. Many of these cancelled survivors were eventually repurposed into generic corpses found in the background of the final games. Their names and their histories were stripped away, leaving only the visual indicator of their failure to escape. This systematic removal of the human element was a deliberate choice to keep the player focused on the monsters, rather than the people who were lost. Furthermore, there were plans for an interconnected survivor system where the actions of the player in one part of the city would affect the fate of a survivor in another. This would have created a much more dynamic and emotional experience, as the player would feel the direct impact of their failures. Capcom scrapped this system due to technical limitations and the desire for a more linear and predictable narrative. They wanted a story that they could control entirely, rather than one that could branch off into hundreds of different tragic outcomes. This decision made the game more polished, but it also made the world of Raccoon Cities feel static and empty of human consequence beyond the main cast. The clinical reality of these cancelled stories is the study of narrative efficiency. Capcom understood that for every minute of story they added, they had to ensure it contributed to the overall pace of the game. If a survivor's story didn't lead directly to a new weapon or a boss fight, it was deemed unnecessary. This led to the erasure of the very people who would have made Raccoon City feel like a home. The city became a graveyard of potential stories, a place where the ghosts of the cancelled survivors still linger in the files of the early drafts. The cancelled survivor stories are a reminder of a time when Resident Evil was trying to be a much more empathetic and human horror experience before it became a legend of cold, clinical survival. One of the most drastic shifts in the history of the franchise occurred during the development of Resident Evil 4, which went through multiple iterations before arriving at the version we know today. The most famous of these is the version known as the Hookman, or the Fog build, also referred to as Resident Evil 3.5. This version was a radical departure from the series' biological roots, featuring Leon Kennedy fighting paranormal entities in a haunted European castle. There were no parasites in this draft. Leon was infected with a virus that caused him to suffer from intense hallucinations, including blue fog, black shadows, and a terrifying spectre known as the Hookman, who would emerge from paintings to attack him. The clinical reality of this build was an attempt to shift the franchise toward a more psychological and abstract form of horror. The developers wanted to explore the idea of a virus that attacked the mind as much as the body, creating a world where the player could not trust their own senses. This was a direct response to the success of titles like Silent Hill, which were dominating the psychological horror market at the time. However, Capcom eventually abandoned this direction because the ghost angle did not fit the biological and scientific foundation of the series. They feared that if they moved into the supernatural, they would lose the identity of Resident Evil as a franchise about man-made biohazards. Furthermore, the Hookman build was technically difficult to render on the hardware of the time. The transition between the real world and the hallucination world required a level of visual fidelity that the GameCube struggled to maintain at a consistent frame rate. This technical hurdle, combined with the narrative identity crisis, led to the project being scrapped entirely. The assets were repurposed into other titles, like Devil May Cry, but the specific supernatural horror of Resident Evil 3.5 was lost. This was a pivotal moment where Capcom decided that they would never leave the realm of science, even if it meant sacrificing some of their most creative and atmospheric ideas. The sorrow of the abandoned supernatural story is the realization that Resident Evil almost became a much more experimental and haunting franchise. The Hookman build offered a level of intimacy and psychological dread that the final action-oriented Resident Evil 4 lacked. By rejecting the ghosts, Capcom ensured the long-term viability of the series as a biological science fiction brand, but they closed the door on a world of abstract terror. The blue fog and the black shadows remain as ghost lore fragments, a reminder of a version of Leon Kennedy who was fighting his own mind as much as the monsters. This was the moment Capcom killed the occult to save the science, and the franchise was changed forever. Following the development of the Hookman build and the multiple failed iterations of Resident Evil 4, there was a state of internal panic at Capcom. The developers realized that the traditional fixed camera horror style was losing its appeal, and that the supernatural direction was a dead end. Shinji Mikami made the executive decision to scrap the horror-focused elements and move toward the over-the-shoulder action style that would eventually revolutionize the industry. This was the moment Capcom killed horror to save the franchise. They understood that to stay relevant in a changing market, they had to prioritize the player's sense of empowerment and tactical control over their sense of vulnerability and fear. The clinical reality of this shift was a total revaluation of the brand's core values. Capcom moved away from the idea of the player as a victim and toward the idea of the player as a highly skilled combatant. The slow-building dread of the earlier games was replaced by a fast-paced, adrenaline-fueled experience. This change was necessary because the sales of the traditional horror entries were declining, and the studio was facing a financial crisis. They needed a blockbuster, and they understood that a blockbuster required action. By sacrificing the pure horror of the early builds, they created a game that was a massive commercial success, but they permanently altered the identity of the franchise. Furthermore, the technical shift to the over-the-shoulder camera meant that the claustrophobic feeling of the fixed angles was gone. The player now had total awareness of their surroundings and a much greater ability to fight back. This killed the feeling of being trapped that had defined the first decade of the series. Capcom justified this by arguing that the character of Leon Kennedy had evolved into a super soldier and that the gameplay needed to reflect that evolution. However, this was a retroactive justification for a commercial decision. They were moving where the money was, and the money was in action. The sorrow of this transition is the realization that Resident Evil stopped trying to be scary and started trying to be cool. The monsters became targets, the environments became arenas, and the horror became a background element. While Resident Evil 4 is a masterpiece of game design, it represents the death of the original vision of the series as a pure survival horror experience. Capcom chose to save the franchise by turning it into something else entirely. The horror that was killed remains as a ghost lore archive, a reminder of a time when the series was about the fear of the unknown rather than the thrill of the kill. This decision set the stage for the action-heavy sequels that would eventually lead to the total saturation of Resident Evil 6. Even after the decision was made to move toward an action-oriented style, there was an early version of the final Resident Evil 4 that retained a significant psychological horror arc. In this build, Leon Kennedy was meant to suffer from a much more detailed mental breakdown as the Las Plagas parasite took hold of his nervous system. There were planned sequences where Leon would experience intense hallucinations that affected the gameplay, such as seeing enemies that weren't there, or navigating a landscape that was distorted by his own fear. These mechanics were intended to show the internal struggle of the protagonist and to maintain a link to the game's horror roots. The clinical sorrow of this cut arc is the realization that Leon was originally meant to be a much more vulnerable and fractured character. The developers wanted to show that even a highly trained agent could be broken by a biological parasite. However, Capcom eventually removed these fear mechanics because they felt they interfered with the flow of the action. They wanted the player to feel powerful, and the hallucination sequences were deemed too frustrating for the average gamer. By removing the psychological arc, they made the game more accessible, but they turned Leon into a static action hero who was largely unfazed by the infection in his brain. Furthermore, there were planned sequences where Leon would have to perform self-surgery or other extreme measures to delay the progression of the parasite. These would have been intense, high-stakes moments of body horror. Capcom cut these as well, fearing that they were too graphic and would slow down the momentum of the game. They chose to simplify the infection into a narrative plot point that was solved in a few scripted cutscenes. This decision erased the most personal and terrifying aspect of the game, leaving the player to focus only on the external threats of the Ganados and the cult. The clinical reality of the cut psychological arc is the study of how a game is polished for the mass market. Capcom understood that the public wanted a smooth and empowering experience. They didn't want to struggle with a protagonist who was losing his mind or his body. By removing the fear mechanics and the hallucinations, they created a game that was perfect for the action genre, but they lost the depth of the horror they had originally planned. The cut psychological arc remains as ghost lore a reminder of a version of Resident Evil 4 that was much more intimate and disturbing. It was the last time the franchise attempted to marry deep psychological horror with high-stakes action before the total pivot toward the blockbuster style of the later entries. The transition from the supernatural builds of Resident Evil 4 to the final release was a chaotic process that left dozens of narrative threads dangling or entirely severed. In the original drafts for the mission in Spain, the villains were intended to have a much more complex and interconnected history that explained the biological lineage of the Las Plagas. One significant storyline that was never finished involved a deeper exploration of the relationship between Osmond Sadler and the original aristocratic families of the region. There were planned flashbacks and environmental storytelling cues that would have revealed that the cult was not just a group of religious fanatics, but the remnants of an ancient genetic experiment that predated Umbrella by centuries. This would have turned the Las Plagas into a much older and more terrifying biological constant in the world. The character of Bitores Mendez, the village chief, was originally intended to have a far more expanded role as a recurring psychological tormentor for Leon Kennedy. In the early scripts, Mendez was a man who was struggling against the parasite's influence, attempting to maintain his duty to the villagers while being consumed by Sadler's neural commands. This would have added a tragic, human layer to the initial hours of the game. Capcom eventually simplified his character into a silent, hulking boss, because they felt the emotional nuance slowed down the pacing of the action. By cutting his unfinished arc, they turned a potential character study of biological possession into a traditional monster encounter. This decision was part of the larger move toward narrative efficiency that defined the project's final months. Furthermore, the themes of isolation and lost history were largely abandoned in the final act. The island sequence was originally envisioned as a much larger and more disturbing archaeological dig, where the player would find evidence of previous failed attempts to weaponize the Plagas by various global powers throughout the 19th century. This would have shifted the narrative weight away from the Los Illuminados cult and toward the idea of the Plagas as a sought-after resource for the world's shadow governments. Capcom felt this was too complex and potentially confusing, so they focused the ending on a standard rescue mission and a final confrontation with Sadler. The unfinished themes remain as ghost lore in the game's environment, suggesting a much deeper story that was never allowed to reach its conclusion. The clinical sorrow of these unfinished storylines is the realization that Resident Evil 4 was once a game about the weight of time and the horror of ancient biology. By cutting the character arcs and the historical context, Capcom created a fast-paced action masterpiece, but lost the intellectual depth of the original drafts. The villains became caricatures of evil, rather than victims of an ancient biological tragedy. This period of development remains a study in how a corporation prunes a narrative to ensure it does not distract from the gameplay. The unfinished stories of Spain are a silent testament to a version of Leon Kennedy's journey that was much more scholarly and disturbing than the one we eventually played. Part 12. Resident Evil 5. The dark story Capcom backed away from. The original vision for Resident Evil 5, as seen in the 1995 announcement trailer, was intended to be a far more isolated and sun-drenched horror experience than the cooperative action title it eventually became. In the early concepts, Chris Redfield was alone in an African desert, and the extreme heat was a mechanical and psychological factor that caused him to suffer from hallucinations and physical fatigue. The enemies, known as the Magini, moved with a terrifying and jittery speed that suggested a total loss of biological control. This build was focused on the claustrophobia of the open spaces, a feeling of being hunted in a world where there was nowhere to hide from the sun or the shadows. Capcom eventually backed away from this tone to prioritize the cooperative gameplay mechanics that were becoming popular at the time. The clinical reality of this shift was the total erasure of the game's original atmospheric identity. The developers wanted to explore the idea of a soldier who was losing his mind under the pressure of the environment and the viral threat. The hallucinations were meant to force the player to question what was real, creating a state of perpetual uncertainty. However, during internal testing, Capcom found that the heat mechanics and the hallucinations were frustrating for players and difficult to balance in a cooperative setting. They decided to soften the tone and increase the ammunition count, turning the game into an urban combat experience. This move ensured massive sales, but it killed the unique psychological horror that had defined the game's early reveal. Furthermore, the original story featured a much more significant role for the progenitor virus and the ancient origins of the Endopia tribe. The early drafts envisioned Chris exploring ancient ruins that were filled with thousands of years of biological history, showing that the virus was a fundamental part of the tribe's culture and religion. This would have been a direct continuation of the ancient biology themes that were scrapped from Resident Evil 4. Capcom simplified this for the final release, focusing instead on a corporate conspiracy involving Tricell and Wesker. The claustrophobic heat horror was replaced by a series of high-stakes action set pieces, effectively erasing the most creative and atmospheric elements of the game's original design. The sorrow of this lost vision is the realization that Resident Evil 5 almost redefined what environmental horror could be. It could have been a study of how a familiar soldier breaks under the weight of a hostile landscape. By choosing to make it a co-op action game, Capcom ensured it was a blockbuster, but they abandoned the chance to push the series into a more sophisticated and disturbing direction. The original dark story of the African desert remains as ghost lore, a reminder of a game that was too ambitious for its own commercial goals. It was the moment the series definitively chose the thrill of the kill over the dread of the sun. During the development of Resident Evil 5, Capcom encountered a significant moral and political controversy that forced a total rewrite of several key story arcs. Early trailers showing a white protagonist killing crowds of black enemies in an African setting sparked a wave of public criticism regarding racial insensitivity and colonialist undertones. While Capcom initially defended their creative vision, the internal pressure led to the introduction of Sheva Alomar as a co-protagonist to balance the racial optics of the game. This was not just a character addition. It forced the developers to rewrite the entire narrative from a solo survival experience into a partner-based action story. This shift fundamentally changed the pacing, the atmosphere, and the ending of the game. The clinical reality of this rewrite was the systematic removal of certain story ideas that were deemed too controversial or ethically crossed. Original drafts featured more aggressive depictions of the local population being subjected to viral testing by Umbrella and Tricell in ways that mirrored real-world historical atrocities. Capcom felt that including these elements would make the game too politically charged and potentially toxic for the brand. They chose to simplify the conflict into a standard stop-the-villain plot, erasing the deeper social and ethical questions they had originally planned to explore. This decision made the game safer for the global market, but it resulted in a story that felt hollow and disconnected from its setting. Furthermore, the introduction of co-op necessitated a change in the level design and the enemy AI. The original jittery speed of the Magini was slowed down to allow two players to coordinate their fire. The claustrophobic and isolated feeling of the early builds was replaced by a sense of military dominance. The controversy essentially acted as a catalyst for Capcom to fully embrace the action genre, moving as far away from the disturbing roots as possible. This was a pivotal moment where politics and public perception reshaped the narrative of a major franchise, showing that even the most powerful creators must answer to the sensitivities of the market. The sorrow of the rewrite is not the addition of Sheva, who is a well-realized character, but the loss of the game's original, uncompromising tone. Resident Evil 5 was originally meant to be an uncomfortable and provocative look at biological exploitation. By softening the edges, Capcom created a successful product, but they erased the most challenging parts of their own story. The moral controversy remains a significant chapter in the game's history, a reminder of the time when the real world forced its way into the laboratory of Resident Evil and demanded that the story be changed. The original, darker narrative of the African outbreak is now a ghost lore archive, a world that was deemed too dangerous to release. Part 14. Wesker's alternate endings. The final confrontation between Chris Redfield and Albert Wesker in the volcano of Resident Evil 5 was originally intended to have several different outcomes, some of which would have left the future of the series in a state of total uncertainty. In early drafts of the script, Wesker had a much more ambiguous fate that would have allowed him to remain a shadow entity in future games. One scrapped ending involved Wesker successfully completing the ascension process with the Ouroboros virus and simply vanishing into the atmosphere, leaving Chris and Sheva to stand in the ruins of their failure. This would have turned Wesker into a permanent, god-like antagonist that the BSAA could never truly kill. Another scrapped version involved Wesker surviving the dual rocket blast in the lava. In this draft, the virus would have reacted to the extreme heat by entering a state of dormant crystallization, allowing Wesker's body to be recovered by a secret third-party organization. This would have set the stage for a later resurrection in a new, more terrifying form. Capcom eventually rejected these ideas because they felt the fans needed definitive closure for the 1998 storyline. They wanted to kill the primary villain, to signal the end of the original era of the franchise. By choosing a definitive and graphic death, they provided a sense of finality, but they sacrificed the long-term potential of their most iconic character. Furthermore, there was a planned ending where Chris Redfield did not survive the volcano. In this dark draft, Chris would have sacrificed himself to ensure Wesker stayed in the lava, leaving Shiva as the sole survivor and the new face of the BSAA. Capcom felt this was too bleak and would alienate the long-term fans of the series who were deeply attached to Chris. They chose the Hollywood ending, where both heroes escape on a helicopter, effectively erasing the most dramatic and high-stakes outcome for the characters. This was another example of Capcom prioritizing brand safety over narrative risk, ensuring that their most valuable assets remained available for future sequels. The clinical reality of these alternate endings is the study of how a corporation manages its intellectual property. Wesker was too valuable to kill, yet too powerful to keep alive without breaking the narrative balance of the world. By killing him off, Capcom simplified the future of the series, but they lost the unique tension that his presence provided. The alternate endings, where Wesker won or survived, remain as ghost lore fragments, suggesting a timeline where the biological threat was far more absolute. Wesker's definitive death in 2009 was a corporate decision to clear the board for a new generation of villains, a move that many fans still debate to this day. Part 15. Resident Evil 6. The story that collapsed under its own weight. Resident Evil 6 was the most ambitious project in the history of the franchise, featuring 4 interconnected campaigns and a global narrative that spanned several continents. However, the development of this title was so chaotic that entire narrative arcs and character motivations were removed or rewritten mid-production. The original script for the game was significantly longer and more complex, featuring a deeper exploration of the Neo-Umbrella conspiracy and the internal politics of the United States government. Many of these elements were cut because the game was already becoming too large to manage, leading to a final product that felt fragmented and narratively inconsistent. One significant arc that was removed involved a more detailed history for Jake Muller and his relationship with the legacy of Albert Wesker. In the early drafts, Jake was not just a mercenary with special blood. He was actively hunted by remnants of the Wesker project, who viewed him as a biological loose end. This would have added a layer of personal stakes to his campaign and tied it more directly to the 1990s lore. Capcom simplified this to keep the focus on his relationship with Sherry Birkin and the action set pieces. By cutting his background, they turned a potentially deep character study into a standard action hero arc. This was a recurring problem for Resident Evil 6, as every campaign suffered from narrative trimming to ensure the game stayed within its massive budget and release window. Furthermore, the character of Ada Wong went through several different iterations during development. There was a scrapped storyline where Ada was not being mimicked by Carla Radames, but was actually suffering from a dissociative identity disorder caused by a new viral strain. This would have been a much darker and more psychological take on her character. Capcom eventually chose the clone plot because it was easier to explain in an action game setting and allowed for more traditional boss fights. The collapsed weight of the story meant that many of the most interesting and experimental ideas were buried in the game's files, leaving the public with a narrative that felt like a collection of action movie tropes rather than a cohesive horror experience. The sorrow of Resident Evil 6 is the realization that it was a game that tried to be everything to everyone and ended up being nothing to many. By attempting to cover so much ground, Capcom lost the intimacy and the focus that made the earlier games successful. The removed arcs and rewritten characters are a testament to a project that was too big for its own good. The ghost lore of Resident Evil 6 is a vast and messy archive of potential that was never realized. A world of global apocalypse that was simplified into a series of explosions. It was the moment the franchise reached its limit for scale, forcing a total reboot for the next entry. Part 16, cancelled global apocalypse scenarios. During the development of the global era of Resident Evil, which included titles like Resident Evil 6 and the various animated films, Capcom explored several scenarios that involved the total and irreversible collapse of human civilization. These cancelled global apocalypse scenarios were intended to show the endgame of biological weaponry, where the viruses became self-sustaining and the human race was reduced to small pockets of survivors in a ruined world. This would have shifted the franchise into a post-apocalyptic genre similar to Mad Max or The Last of Us. Capcom eventually abandoned these ideas because they felt that the modern world setting was a core part of the brand's identity, and that moving into a total apocalypse would prevent them from telling stories about governments and corporations. The clinical reality of these cancelled scenarios was a fear of narrative finality. If the world ends, there are no more police stations to visit, no more mansions to explore, and no more conspiracies to uncover. The war against bioterror requires a functioning society to act as the stakes. By keeping the outbreaks localized and containable, Capcom ensures that the series can continue indefinitely. The global apocalypse ideas were deemed too hopeless and would have limited the game's sequel potential. They chose to keep the status quo of a world perpetually on the brink of disaster, but never quite falling over the edge. This decision maintained the commercial viability of the brand, but it robbed the series of its most dramatic and high-stakes outcome. Furthermore, There were planned storylines involving the extinction of the human race being replaced by a new viral species. This was a direct legacy of Wesker's Ouroboros vision. The early drafts of Resident Evil 6 envisioned a world where the C virus successfully transformed a significant portion of the global population into a new hive mind organism. This would have been a radical departure from the series and would have changed the genre from horror to dark science fiction. Capcom felt this was too abstract and potentially alienating for the player base. They chose to keep the enemies as monsters to be shot, rather than a new stage of life, preserving the traditional combat loop of the series. The sorrow of the cancelled apocalypse is the realization that Resident Evil is a franchise that is permanently afraid of its own logical conclusion. The viruses are designed to end the world, yet the world never ends. This creates a state of narrative stagnation, where the heroes win, the world resets, and the cycle repeats. The universe that never was, where the bioweapons actually won, is a haunting archive of what could have been a much more serious and final story. By avoiding total extinction plots, Capcom saved the franchise's future, but they lost the chance to tell a definitive and world-changing tale. Part 17. Scrapped bioweapon programs that were too extreme. The internal design documents for the various laboratories in Resident Evil are filled with scrapped bioweapon programs that were deemed too ethically crossed, or too disturbing even for a horror game. One significant program that was cut involved the concept of living armor. These were BOWs that were literally grafted onto human hosts, while the hosts were still conscious and sentient. The idea was to create a symbiotic weapon, where the human provided the tactical intelligence and the virus provided the physical dominance. This went beyond the typical mutation and entered the territory of prolonged medical torture. Capcom removed these concepts because they felt they ventured into areas of cruelty that would alienate the player base and potentially lead to legal issues in certain markets. The clinical reality of these scrapped programs was a study of the limit of revulsion. Capcom understood that there is a difference between a monster and systematic abuse. By keeping the mutations fast and total, they allowed the player to view the enemies as non-human. The living armor concept would have forced the player to confront the suffering of the host in real time. This was deemed too dark for an entertainment product. Another scrap program involved the use of children as vectors for a specific viral strain that targeted paternal and maternal instincts. This was cut almost immediately, as it crossed a moral line that Capcom was never willing to tread. They wanted the horror to be visceral, but not emotionally traumatizing in a way that felt predatory. Furthermore, there were plans for bioweapon programs that utilized reproductive biology to create self-replicating armies. These breeder mutations were intended to show the absolute perversion of the human life cycle by the T virus and the G virus. The early drafts of the Archaeology laboratory and the Nest featured rooms dedicated to these horrific experiments. Capcom chose to simplify the biology into a more standard infection and mutation model to keep the game accessible. The scrapped programs represent a version of Resident Evil that was much more focused on the medical and ethical atrocities of the Umbrella Corporation, making the company feel like a much more realistic and terrifying entity. The sorrow of these scrap programs is the loss of the true weight of Umbrella's crimes. By removing the most extreme experiments, Capcom made the corporation feel like a cartoonish group of villains rather than a realistic medical nightmare. The universe that never was, where these programs existed, is a much darker and more ethically challenging place. These ideas remain as ghost lore fragments in the internal archives, a reminder of the pure biological horror that the developers were capable of envisioning before the corporate mandate for a safe and marketable horror brand took over. Part 18. Resident Evil 7. The story before Ethan. Before the decision was made to introduce Ethan Winters as the everyman protagonist of Resident Evil 7, the project went through several iterations that featured entirely different characters and themes. The early concepts for the game did not feature a search for a missing wife in a Louisiana bayou. Instead, the protagonist was originally intended to be a specialized investigator or a tactical agent searching for a missing research team. This would have made the game feel much more like a traditional Resident Evil title, with a focus on professional agents and corporate conspiracies from the very beginning. Capcom eventually scrapped this in favor of the first-person, soft reboot style, to regain the sense of vulnerability that the series had lost. The clinical reality of this shift was a desire to escape the superhero baggage of Chris and Leon. The developers felt that the series had become too focused on high-stakes action, and that the only way to make it scary again was to introduce a character who had no combat training. The story before Ethan was a more traditional, tactical horror experience that felt too similar to the previous entries. By deleting the original protagonist and the tactical focus, Capcom was able to create a more intimate and claustrophobic horror experience. The origin of the mold was also much darker in the early drafts, involving a direct connection to an ancient ritualistic cult in the bayou, rather than a corporate bioweapon laboratory. This would have added an occult and folk horror element to the game. Furthermore, the Baker family was originally envisioned as being much more in control of their actions, serving as a group of willing cultists rather than tragic victims of Evelyn's infection. This would have made the family much more villainous and less sympathetic. Capcom chose to make them victims to add a layer of tragedy to the story, effectively erasing the cult angle of the earlier drafts. The Louisiana Bayou setting was also much larger and more open in the early concepts, featuring more environmental puzzles and a slower pace. The final version of Resident Evil 7 was a more focused and linear experience, which Capcom felt was necessary to maintain the intensity of the first-person perspective. The sorrow of the story before Ethan is the loss of the game's original, more expansive world, while the final Resident Evil 7 is a masterpiece of modern horror. The early drafts suggested a game that was much more focused on the intersection of ancient folk horror and modern biological science. The removed cult elements and the tactical protagonist remain as ghost lore, a reminder of a time when Capcom was trying to figure out how to reinvent the brand without losing its identity. By choosing Ethan Winters, they created a new legend, but they buried a version of the story that was much more grounded in the series' original occult and scientific roots. Part 19. Storylines from Village that were quietly removed. Resident Evil Village was a culmination of the modern era of the franchise, but its development was marked by the quiet removal of several significant subplots and characters that would have added more depth to the world of the Four Lords. One major storyline that was removed involved an expanded role for Mother Miranda's connection to the original Umbrella founders. In the early drafts, there were planned sequences where the player would find more direct evidence of Miranda's influence on Oswell Spencer, showing that she was the true architect of the entire Resident Evil universe. Capcom felt this was too much of a retcon and might complicate the legacy of the original games, so they kept her connection as a minor file discovery. Another storyline that was quietly removed involved an alternate outcome for Ethan Winters. There were early scripts where Ethan did not die at the end of the game, but was instead transformed into a stable biological entity that would serve as a permanent guardian of the village. This would have made him a more enduring and potentially darker protagonist for future games. Capcom chose the sacrificial ending to provide emotional closure for his arc, and to clear the way for Rose Winters to become the new focus of the series. This was another example of Capcom prioritizing narrative finality for their protagonists to avoid the immortal hero problem of the earlier games. Furthermore, the character of Lady Dimitrescu was originally intended to have a much larger presence in the game, including an entire subplot regarding her brother, who was also a lord of the region. This character was entirely removed during production to keep the focus on the 4 primary lords and to streamline the game's pacing. Many of the leaks from the game's development suggest that the castle sequence was originally twice as long and featured more psychological horror elements. Capcom trimmed this content to ensure the game maintained its theme park style of pacing, where the player moves quickly between different types of horror. The clinical sorrow of these removed storylines is the realization that Village was originally a much more complex and lore-heavy game. By trimming the subplots and the extra characters, Capcom created a highly polished and successful product, but they erased the most ambitious parts of the world they had built. The removed lords and the alternate endings remain as ghost lore, suggesting a version of the Resident Evil universe where the connections between the past and the present were much more explicit. Village remains a successful entry, but it is a simplified version of the epic biological tragedy it was originally meant to be. Part 20. Characters who almost became canon. Throughout the history of Resident Evil, there is a long list of characters who were fully designed, scripted, and in some cases modeled, but who never made it into the final games. These characters who almost became canon represent the divergent paths the series could have taken. One such character was a third protagonist for Resident Evil 0, a female scientist who would have provided a more research-focused perspective on the Arklay outbreak. This character was removed to simplify the partner zapping system and to keep the focus on Rebecca and Billy. This erasure meant that the game's story became a more traditional action escape rather than a scientific investigation. Another significant character who was almost canon was a rival for Wesker in the early drafts of the 1990s. This character was intended to be another child of the project who had gone rogue and was working against both Umbrella and Wesker. This would have created a much more complex three-way conflict during the Raccoon City incident. Capcom chose to focus entirely on Wesker as the primary antagonist to avoid confusing the audience and to build him up as the ultimate villain of the series. This decision made Wesker a legend, but it erased the possibility of a more nuanced and competitive villain landscape in the early games. Furthermore, many of the protagonists of the spin-off titles like Outbreak were originally intended to appear in the main games as supporting characters. There were planned sequences in Resident Evil 3 where Jill would encounter the Outbreak cast and work with them to escape the city. Capcom removed these crossovers to maintain the focus on the primary heroes and to keep the spin-offs as separate entities. This decision made the world of Resident Evil feel more fragmented and less like a living city. The characters who almost became canon remain as ghost lore fragments, a reminder of the hundreds of voices and stories that were silenced to ensure the spotlight remained on the core cast. The sorrow of these erased characters is the realization that the Resident Evil universe is much smaller than it was meant to be. For every hero we know, there is a ghost hero who was deleted because they didn't fit the commercial mandate of the time. These characters represent the pure creativity of the developers, a world where the tragedy of the outbreaks was shared by dozens of unique individuals, rather than a handful of super soldiers. They exist now only in the archives of the early drafts, a silent audience to a history that moved on without them. The characters who almost became canon are the ultimate proof of Capcom's silent retcon policy, a total deletion of potential to maintain the brand's elite status. Part 21. Endings Capcom refused to release. Throughout the 3-decade history of the franchise, Capcom has systematically scrapped dozens of endings that were deemed too hopeless or too definitive for a commercial product. The clinical reality of a long-running series is that it requires a state of permanent tension, and a truly final bad ending effectively stops the momentum of the brand. One of the most significant endings Capcom refused to release was a draft for Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, in which Jill Valentine failed to reach the rescue helicopter and was consumed by the thermal flash of the tactical nuclear strike. This ending would have turned Jill into a tragic martyr, but Capcom vetoed it because they recognized her as a high-value intellectual property that needed to remain available for future sequels. They chose the narrow escape trope because it preserves the assets of the company while providing the illusion of closure for the player. Another example of an erased conclusion was a scrapped ending for Resident Evil 2, where Leon Kennedy began to exhibit signs of infection during the final escape sequence. In this version, the game would have ended with Leon staring into a mirror as his eyes took on the predatory hue of the T-virus, suggesting that the hero of the story was already a dead man walking. Capcom felt this was too bleak and would prevent Leon from becoming the action hero archetype they envisioned for the future of the series. By removing the hopeless endings, Capcom maintains a world where the heroes always win, just enough to stay alive for the next disaster. This avoids the finality problem and ensures that the war against bioterrorism remains a never-ending cycle of consumption and profit for the corporation. Furthermore, Capcom has historically avoided nihilistic endings, where the bioweapon wins on a global scale. In the early drafts of Resident Evil 6, there was a planned ending for the Chris Redfield campaign, where the C-virus successfully reached a critical mass, turning the entire population of the Eastern Hemisphere into a hive mind colony. This would have shifted the series into a post-apocalyptic genre, but Capcom realized that such a drastic change would make the modern world setting of future games impossible. They chose to keep the catastrophes localized and contained through the intervention of the heroes. This creates a state of narrative stagnation, where the stakes are always high, but the status quo is never truly shattered. The endings they refuse to release represent a version of Resident Evil that was willing to let the world die to tell a more honest and terrifying story. The clinical sorrow of these rejected endings is the loss of genuine consequence. When the audience knows that the main characters will always survive and the world will always be saved, the horror loses its edge. The universe that never was, where Jill died in Raccoon City or Leon became a monster, is a place of profound, dramatic weight. By choosing brand safety over narrative risk, Capcom protected their financial interests, but they hollowed out the emotional stakes of their own universe. The hopeless endings remain as ghost lore fragments in the design documents, a reminder of a time when the developers were willing to follow the horror to its logical, devastating conclusion. They were silenced to ensure the blockbuster could continue its march into the future. Part 22. Cut lore that later became canon. The history of Resident Evil is a cycle of reuse and recycling, where ideas that were once deemed too experimental or technically impossible are quietly reintroduced years later as new lore. This process allows Capcom to utilize their back catalogue of scrapped concepts while maintaining the facade of a constantly evolving universe. A primary example of this is the concept of a stalker enemy that can move freely through an entire environment. This was originally planned for the Nemesis in the 1999 version of Resident Evil 3, but technical limitations forced the developers to keep his appearances scripted. This cut lore was later perfected and reintroduced as a core mechanic for Mr. X in the Resident Evil 2 remake and for Lady Dimitrescu in Resident Evil Village. The scrapped ideas of the past often become the innovation of the present. Another significant example of reused lore is the parasite concept from the early drafts of Resident Evil 1. In the very first design documents from 1994, there was an idea for a creature that lived inside a human host and controlled their nervous system. This was cut because the developers wanted to focus on the more traditional zombie and mutation models for the Arclay incident. However, this discarded idea served as the foundational seed for the Las Plagas in Resident Evil 4. Capcom essentially reached into their wastebasket of 10-year-old ideas to find a way to reinvent the franchise. This proves that no idea is truly scrapped in the Capcom offices. It is merely placed in deep storage until the market or the technology is ready to receive it. Furthermore, the silent retcon is often used to bring back characters or themes that were previously erased. The return of Albert Wesker in Resident Evil Code Veronica was a massive retcon of his definitive death in the first game. This was done because Capcom realized they had killed off their most interesting antagonist too early. They utilized the prototype virus lore, which was largely developed after the fact, to explain his resurrection. This created a retroactive consistency that allowed them to build the Wesker legacy that defined the series for the next decade. The cut lore of the past acts as a reservoir of potential that Capcom can tap into whenever the current storyline begins to lose its momentum. It is a cynical but effective way to maintain a sense of deep history without actually having to plan for it in advance. The clinical reality of this recycled lore is the study of efficient narrative management. Capcom understands that a good idea is never truly wasted. By keeping the ghost lore in their internal files, they have a constant source of inspiration for reboots and remakes. The sorrow of this process is that it often makes the universe feel repetitive and circular. We are constantly seeing the same themes of the ancient virus or the trapped survivor being dressed up in new graphics and sold as a new experience. The universe that never was is slowly being integrated into the universe we have, but it is being done in a way that prioritizes marketable features over organic storytelling. Capcom is the ultimate master of unlocking their own archives to ensure the brand stays relevant without ever having to take a truly original risk. Part 23. Stories fans only know through leaks and files. In the modern era of digital transparency, much of the most disturbing and profound Resident Evil lore exists only as hidden fragments within the code of the games, or as leaked design documents that Capcom has never officially acknowledged. These fragments represent the ghost lore of the series, narratives that were cut so late in development that their remnants still cling to the final product like a phantom limb. A primary example is the Brother of Dimitrescu subplot found in the internal files of Resident Evil Village. These files suggest that there was an entire fifth lord in the village, a male counterpart to Alcina, who occupied a more industrial or underground section of the map. Capcom never mentioned this character in the marketing or the final game, leaving his existence as a mystery for data miners and lore enthusiasts to exhume. Another significant piece of ghost lore is the sinister Duke theory, supported by hidden dialogue lines and early script drafts from Village. These files suggest that the Duke was originally intended to be the final antagonist, or a much more malevolent entity who was manipulating Ethan Winters for his own parasitic ends. Capcom likely felt that having a friendly merchant was more beneficial for the gameplay loop, so they stripped away his villainous origins and left him as an enigmatic figure. These leaked stories provide a glimpse into a version of the game that was much more cynical and less theme park in its approach to horror. They represent the moments where Capcom decided to protect the player's comfort by removing the most profound betrayals of the narrative. Furthermore, the darker origins of the mold were hidden in a series of cut documents from Resident Evil 7. These files detailed a more direct connection between the mold and an ancient, ritualistic practice in the Louisiana Bayou, involving the systematic feeding of a local deity. This would have shifted the game from a corporate bioweapon story into a pure folk horror nightmare. Capcom likely chose the Evelyn as a bioweapon angle because it fits the brand's scientific identity. But the ghost lore remains as a haunting reminder of the occult roots they were afraid to fully embrace. Fans who study these leaks are seeing the real Resident Evil, the one that exists before the corporate marketing teams decide what is acceptable for a mass audience to consume. The clinical reality of these hidden stories is the study of digital archaeology. For many fans, the game on the disc is just the surface. The true story is found in the hex codes and the discarded assets. Capcom's silence regarding these leaks is a form of passive censorship, a refusal to acknowledge the more extreme or abstract versions of their own creation. The stories known only through leaks are the final sanctuary for the pure horror that once defined the series. They are the unpolished, raw, and disturbing ideas that Capcom felt were too much for the average consumer. In the archives of the internet, the universe that never was lives on, providing a deeper and more terrifying experience than the one Capcom officially permits us to have. Part 24. The darkest Resident Evil ideas Capcom buried. As we reach the final layers of this forensic audit, we must acknowledge the absolute darkness that Capcom systematically buried to maintain their status as a global entertainment leader. These are the ethical lines that the corporation refused to cross, ideas involving the total perversion of human life that would have made Resident Evil a target for international bans and legal prosecution. One such idea involved a viral reproductive program, where the T-virus was used to create a generation of children who were born as weapons. The internal documents for the 1990s labs featured rooms that were clearly designed for incubation of human biological material in ways that suggested the most profound violations of medical ethics. Capcom chose to focus on mutation and zombies because these are safe fantasy horrors. The reality of industrialized human breeding was too close to real-world atrocities for a video game to survive. Another buried idea was the concept of psychological viral saturation, where a pathogen was designed not to kill, but to permanently alter the moral compass of an entire population, creating a society that viewed violence as a biological necessity. This would have turned the Resident Evil world into a study of social Darwinism, taken to a horrific extreme. Capcom felt this was too abstract and potentially too political for their audience. They wanted clear heroes and clear monsters, not a world where everyone was a complicit part of a biological machine. By burying these ideas, Capcom ensured that Resident Evil remained a fun horror series, where the player could always feel superior to the enemies they were killing. They removed the ethical mirror that would have forced the player to question their own role in the violence. Furthermore, there were concepts for non-consensual symbiosis, where the player would be forced to make permanent, horrific alterations to their own body to survive a specific environment. This would have turned Resident Evil into a body horror game in the style of David Cronenberg. Capcom chose to keep the mutations as something that happens to other people, or as temporary power-ups for the protagonist. They understood that the mass market does not want to feel repulsed by their own character. By burying these dark ideas, they protected the commercial soul of the franchise. But they lost the chance to create a truly transcendent work of transgressive horror. The ideas they buried are the ones that would have made Resident Evil a permanent, disturbing mark on the human psyche. The clinical reality of these buried ideas is the study of corporate self-preservation. Capcom is a multi-billion-dollar entity that must answer to shareholders and international ratings boards. They cannot afford to be truly transgressive. The universe that never was is a graveyard of these extreme ideas, the ones that were deemed too ethics crossed, even for a game about a zombie apocalypse. These ideas represent the pure horror that exists in the minds of the developers before the reality of the market takes over. They are the secrets of the laboratory that were never allowed to leave the building. A haunting reminder that the most dangerous thing in the Resident Evil universe is not the virus, but the corporate will to keep the nightmare safe for public consumption. Part 25. The Resident Evil universe that never existed. The final conclusion of this forensic audit is the realization of the universe that never existed, a version of Resident Evil that would have been a niche, disturbing, and profoundly psychological horror experience if Capcom had stuck to their original, uncompromising visions. The supernatural ghosts of 1994, the clinical urban realism of 1997, and the claustrophobic heat of 2005. The franchise would likely have become a respected but commercially limited peer of Silent Hill. It would have been a series about the fragility of the human mind and the total violation of the human form. Instead, by systematically scrapping their most extreme ideas and pivoting toward over-the-shoulder action and B-movie heroism, Capcom created one of the most successful media franchises in history. They chose the blockbuster over the autopsy. The universe that never was remains as a haunting shadow behind the games we play. Every time Leon S. Kennedy cracks a joke or Chris Redfield punches a boulder, we are seeing the corporate solution to a psychological problem. The sorrow of the Resident Evil legacy is the knowledge that the pure, unfiltered biological nightmare was deemed too boring or too scary for the public to handle. We have been given a world of heroes and explosions, but we have been denied the world of blue fog and screaming insects. This is the iron reality of the entertainment industry. The most creative and terrifying ideas are the first ones to be liquidated to ensure a return on investment. The Resident Evil we know is a masterpiece of marketing and technical refinement, but the Resident Evil that could have been is a much more profound and lingering horror. The final reflection on this lost lore is a recognition of the fear that Capcom themselves felt. They were afraid that their creation was too effective. They were afraid that they had opened a door that they could not close. So they spent 30 years building a house around that door, decorating it with action stars and science fiction tropes to distract us from the void on the other side. The universe that never existed is the one that still haunts the developers in their sleep. The one where the virus didn't just kill people, but destroyed the very idea of a safe world. As we close these archives, we must realize that Resident Evil is not just a game about surviving monsters. It is a game about a corporation surviving its own darkest impulses. The ghost lore is the true story, and the canon is just the version they were allowed to tell. The clinical autopsy is complete. We have exhumed the secrets, mapped the retcons, and documented the erasures. Resident Evil remains a global giant, but it is a giant that is built on a foundation of buried dreams and silenced screams. The master of unlocking has finally met a door that he cannot open, the door to the history Capcom refuses to acknowledge. In the end, the most terrifying thing about Resident Evil is not what is in the games, but what was taken out.